Hello and welcome again from this end of the podium as well. And so this is the afternoon session on emerging international law in cyberspace, and where we will talk about the role of international law and norms in furthering security and stability in cyberspace. And I think over the 11 years of CyCon, I have witnessed, together with many of you in the audience, the evolution of international law discussion over cyberspace and state cyber operations. And to recap where we are today, yes, we've probably heard it ad nauseum that it is now fairly generally recognized that existing international law applies to cyberspace. It's been confirmed by the UNGGE reports, by individual and joint statements of nations, in statements of regional organizations, not least, actually, Estonia's official positions on the applicability of international law, or with regard to international law, that the President spoke about yesterday. And the weight of the debate over international law has clearly shifted to how those norms and how international law applies. And this is very clearly a process that is neither predetermined nor singular. We are, figuratively speaking, sitting in a flying airplane and trying to figure out where the norms and how we should steer that. And there are a host of different issues of varied specificity that require answers, certainly from states who, after all, make law. And then there are a few prerequisites that define our options today. As the West, we tend to be, or we hold the position that before inventing new treaty law, the global community could do well to figure out the application of and respect the rules that we already have in place. And secondly, feasibly, all the calls for an international treaty are at best substitute action, and at worst more reasonably hypocrisy. So with these issues pressing, there is now a host of initiatives to bring substance and clarity to what responsible state conduct in cyberspace is, and to promote non-binding international norms driven by states, international and regional organizations, as well as the private sector. They all vary in their scope and purpose and origin, and the content of these proposals fluctuates from elementary and non-specific to fragmented and occasionally contradictory. But all the various parties seek norms for cyberspace and have rather different understanding of the desired end state and the means to get there in particular. But what I appreciate and what we are seeing is clearly propositions for concrete commitments rather than the restatement of the importance of cybersecurity. And whether these initiatives will have a practical impact, and to what, and if so, what it will be, is something that is perfectly fitting to be discussed here at CyCon. So against this backdrop, I'm delighted to introduce to you three insightful speakers. Mrs. Heli Tiirma-Klaar, Ambassador at Large for Cybersecurity at the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and until last year, the head of cyber policy coordination at the European External Action Service. Secondly, going in speaker order, Mr. Nicolas Ott, who is the project manager for cyber and ICT security at the Transnational Threats Department in OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And his article on the rise of the regionals is freshly published in the CyCon book. And then, last but certainly not least, Mr. Stefano Mele, who's a man of many roles. He's a partner and head of technology at Carnelutti law firm in Italy. He's president of the ICT Authority of the Republic of San Marino, and a member of the governing board and president of the Cybersecurity Commission of the Italian Atlantic Committee, among others. So, all, please give them a warm welcome again.
Thank you.
So I'm keen to hear their insight and keen to discuss with the audience as well. So setup-wise, I would like each of the speakers to present their points. You have up to about 20 minutes for that. So feel free to maneuver within that time. And then we might take a couple of immediate questions after that, but then open up, once all the speakers have made their remarks, we'll open up to the floor and to the discussion. So please keep your questions ready, and Ambassador dear Heli, the floor is all yours.
So, thank you. I have to maneuver out from my chair. First of all, I think for us, the practicing diplomats, the question of international law is a paramount question above all other questions, what we are concentrating on right now in our discussions. It is quite clear that states have to behave in this new domain as they behave in conventional domain. Our president yesterday said that if these operations and activities that are going on in cyberspace right now would happen in conventional domain, this would not result with no action. But in cyberspace, quite often all these malicious activities and operations are not bringing any immediate result. We are working on several fronts how we make states behave responsibly in this domain. There have been several different activities since, I'm proud to say, 2007 Estonian attacks, because Estonia was the first country to put forward the ideas to have cyber defense and cyber security policy process in NATO. In OSCE, we pushed for the new GGE in 2009, and we were quite actively advocating for international response to cyber operations and cyber attacks. 12 years after the 2007, we have actually the glass half full. NATO has started with cyber defense policies as early as 2008. The new UNGG has been put together in 2009, and we have had successive GGs from 2009 to 2016-17. The new GG is now going to put together in 2019. So, and we are not still there yet, which also shows that there is a lot of work to do, and therefore the discussions like CyCon and the discussions in other fora what we have had have very high importance for the future of how we are going to preserve the stability and also interoperability of the whole cyber domain. Let me very briefly introduce what kind of international frameworks we have right now, and what are those areas where we are currently working, and maybe those areas where we should do a bit more of effort in order to make sure that cyberspace will be as stable as we want. I am not going to into the procedural questions of the UNGGE and open-ended working group and so on, but I just would like to understand how many of you have not heard the short version of UN Group of Governmental Experts, or UNGGE. So, no, everybody has heard of this. Good. It's an expert audience. You know that the 2013 and 2015 reports of the GGE were quite successful. We had been able to agree on a set of norms and set of principles at the highest level, at the global level, endorsed by the General Assembly. The 2013 report has resulted with notion that states should adhere to the existing international law. And this is not disputed. This is still there. there is an agreement that states are holding up international law also in cyber domain. The 2015 report, however, did not state so strongly anymore that the IHL and UN Charter apply, but it was written that principles of international law apply. And as we know, 2016-2017 report did not succeed in consensus because of the question of international law. And the question of international law is out there also this time around when we start discussions in New York this December within the new GG. Therefore, their international law possibly will be the hot debated issue for 5 to 6 years to come. Also after this cycle of the GG, and maybe even we will have new cycles in the UN. We do not know how the UN process goes. And what we can do in order to provide to this debate is maybe not to get fixated on specific processes in the UN or anywhere else in international organizations, but encourage countries around the world to understand more how the international law applies and how exactly different nations are translating the existing international law into cyber domain. You have heard the Estonian views, what our president presented, and we have heard the views of many other NATO allies on this, also some like-minded countries like Australia. And I think these are the first good steps, and these steps should be taken forward, of course. What we can do is to encourage more nations to come up with the interpretation of how they see the principles of international law apply in cyberspace. And of course, we are here in Tallinn, and we all have been reading Tallinn Manual. I'm sure that there is no person in the audience who hasn't heard about the Tallinn Manual. And Tallinn Manual still remains the most authoritative academic analysis on this issue, helping, however, many nations around the world to understand the basics. So it has a textbook value which we possibly have to appreciate. And in addition to the Tallinn Manual efforts, our national efforts in order to interpret and analyze international law and the principles that we then would follow in our cyber operations or in our response to cyber operations are as important as the legal principles set in the more academic texts. What possibly we have to now look at when we talk about international law are a couple of questions, and each nation has somehow figured out on their own how these questions could be taken forward. So there is a question of sovereignty. We do not know exactly how we are dealing with sovereignty in cyberspace. The UNGG report in 2013 is saying that the international law applies, especially UN Charter. For some nations, the sovereignty was the keystone in this UN Charter there, and for some other nations, it was the collective self-defense. So it's in a way good that the UN Charter is such a broad text that it allows us to analyze those concepts from so different angles. But whereas the Western side was thinking about collective self-defense, some authoritarian countries clearly thought that sovereignty and non-interference to internal affairs was the value in this statement. The other question that still is debated by many nations is the due diligence principle, and what exactly the nations are supposed to be doing in order to also fulfill their due diligence in cyberspace. And related to this, we have the issue of capacity building and helping those nations who cannot help themselves, and to make sure that we are able to have cooperation in investigations with as many countries as possible. And there are a couple of other issues where nations are still trying to figure out how they are approaching this. When the Estonian legal experts got together and put these Estonian ideas on the paper, it wasn't easy even in such a small ecosystem as we have here. So I can imagine what it means for larger countries where you have armies of lawyers and armies of cyber experts. So even in a small country, you will have the debates and discussions and many sequences of meetings on this issue. And the glass is half full, as I said. The understanding of international law is there. We have made the beginning. We have made also the beginning in terms of trust building and confidence building measures. We have the regional confidence building measures. We have the elementary normative framework actually set. And now the question is how we implement it. How we are going to enforce the GG norms, the CBMs, and existing international law. There are several paths of activities, how we can do it, and more efficiently, and how we can start imposing also consequences for those who are not holding up international law or follow the norms. So there are some initiatives amongst the like-minded countries. Also, both EU and NATO have come up with their own policy response frameworks in order to make sure that the perpetrators in cyberspace will not stay unpunished. The EU Cyber Diplomacy Toolbox, which is now widely quoted by many cyber experts, and not only cyber experts, but also the political leaders, is foreseeing many steps and activities in order to respond to the cyber operations. We have statements, we have declarations, we have a joint attribution statement possibilities, and very importantly, finally, we have the sanctions regime agreed amongst all 28 nations to be applicable in case of cyber domain. And we would like to see now to also make sure that some of those sanctions materialize, that our sanctions regime or sanctions framework, which was adopted a few weeks ago, allows us to do. Within NATO, we have the guidelines on operations below the threshold of armed attack, and all the steps what the NATO nations have been doing in order to achieve a more coherent understanding of this issue, and also setting up the mechanisms in order to implement should be going forward. And of course, we have also the other like-minded activities with a group of countries which are sharing the same values of free and open internet, and making sure that we are holding up the international law and the norms-based international order in cyber domain. So I think we are going to see more of these activities in the future, either in EU, NATO, or amongst the like-minded. We, of course, are also putting a lot of effort these days on the UN processes. Especially, we should keep in mind the need for more capacity building for the countries that might not have the same level of maturity as we have. If we want to collaborate in even cybercrime investigations or any other cyber issue with some of the developing nations, we have to make sure that they have the basic infrastructure and basic organizational and legal ability in place in order to respond. And I think from academic perspective, I'm very keen to hear all the debates at CyCon on international law applying and how exactly this or that principle applies. But I also would encourage the more policy-making crowd and political people, even if you don't know exactly how this law applies and what this due diligence means, and because we are not the lawyers, we don't know really all these questions. But it's important that we go out and say, yes, law applies, I know how, and I have experts at home who tell how. So, and I think this boldness is already something that we have to present, especially in the upcoming UN debates. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Heli, and for your view on or representation of the Estonian positions, but also emphasizing the aspect of capacity building, not only understanding and sort of substantiating our view on our views and positions in terms of applicable law. And I particularly enjoyed your sort of, or the parallel I made is from your speech was the states have gotten a hold of the menu of the options that are available to them in terms of international law, but they are struggling with figuring out what the implications of a selection of a particular menu item or course will be in terms of their future activity and their sort of balancing action from other parties. And I definitely echo her call for the policy community to voice their concerns and their interest and their desirable objectives in what they see, where they would like to go within the limits of international law. So next up, it's over to you, Nicholas, and we look forward to you presenting your paper and your findings on the role of international organizations or regional organizations in international stability negotiations. The stage is yours.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here today amongst so many cyber folks and cyber experts. So that's a true honor. Thank you for that. But the big thank you doesn't only go to the organizers and the hosts of this event, but especially to my co-author of this paper, because without her, this paper would have never gotten published and never received the quality that I think we have achieved. So right at the outset, a special shout out to Anna Maria Ursula for her tremendous contribution to this paper. If you ever are looking for some advice on international law and how that applies to some of the policy discussions, reach out to her.
And we're happy to have you in the audience, Maria, as well, sitting in the back.
Let me at the outset say that even though I work for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and that covers parts of my paper, this presentation, of course, also the publication, reflects our own views, our own analysis. So if there's questions sort of on the OEC involvement, I'm happy to put on my OEC hat later on during the Q&A, but the presentation itself sort of reflects my own opinion. So let me start up by underlining that the UN continues to play a central role in exploring how greater cyber stability can be achieved on an international level. No other platform has managed to produce such overarching recommendations that Haley just mentioned, and therefore the big question is, why should we care about regional organizations' efforts in this field? What are they even doing? How's the connection to international discussions on the UN level? And so, right at the outset, let me make this clear that the experience in confidence building measures, capacity building, and other related efforts in these respective regions are quite noteworthy. Moreover, there's two key buzzwords here that I would like you to take away with today. One of them is incubator, the other one is implementer. What I mean with that is that regional organizations quite often serve as an incubator for new ideas and practical efforts that relate to international law and norms development. States enjoy the opportunity to test out, play around options, texts, non-papers, certain workshop series in a regional setting, and if it works, then it might be elevated on an international level, or there might be other procedures in following up upon that. And that's quite a good thing to have, because not everything automatically has to fly on international level. Not everything sort of is scalable in that sense. So having regional organizations in providing this space is quite useful. But on the other side, they also serve as an implementer of the globally accepted agreements, like the GGE report. So we already see there's sort of a back and forth between these two layers. Because in the end, regional organizations turn these UN recommendations into reality in that sense. They sometimes figure out how to attach very practical means to the agreements that are made, either through the GGE reports or other means. The GGE acknowledged that in 2015, and I think the very latest UN GGE resolution, the resolution that sort of created the new GGE also makes it very clear with this new regional consultation process that is about to kick off, that there is a role for regional organizations in this field. So based on these observations, I'd like to use my introductory remarks to address two things. One, how regional organizations can contribute to the new GGE, and two, how regional organizations can improve the cooperation amongst themselves. So as a start, let us quickly recap the four-pillar approach of the GGE report. We have norms, rules, and principles of responsible state behavior. We have confidence-building measures. We have international cooperation and assistance in ICT security and capacity building, and the applicability of international law in the use of ICTs. And it's important to look at the interconnectedness of these four pillars, because there's different themes that are actually connecting the global agreements with regional efforts. What I mean with this is norms to a certain extent need to be socialized. They need to be put into practice. And for example, CBMs are a nice way to actually take care of that. So what I mean by this is if a norm is there to clarify what shall and shall not be done, a CBM can clarify how a certain norm is incorporated into state practice. So you already see there's this inherent connection on sort of a larger level, and then how you actually follow up on it in a practical level. Similarly, several confidence-building measures are designed to keep communications channels open, to connect states with each other. So this is a nice fallback in case norms are broken. You know, they serve as sort of a mechanism that kicks in then when a certain norm is not respected. And then thirdly, also when you look at capacity building, if states don't have the capacity to engage in cyber stability mechanisms, you know, focus needs to be put on building up their national capacities so that they can become an active contributor and increase their international engagement efforts. As some of you might know, the OSCE currently places special emphasis on implementing the already agreed upon CBMs within the OSCE region. And so when the UNGA resolution on a new GGE was passed, I personally wondered how can regional efforts and these global negotiations reinforce each other and make use of the existing procedures and agreements in a practical and sort of constructive outset. And so after some preliminary research, Anna Maria and I were convinced that the upcoming series of UN negotiations and the final reports of both working groups could significantly benefit from increased collaboration with regional organizations. Let us not forget that regional organizations have developed their own innovative ideas on how to address some of the most pertinent international cybersecurity policy challenges. So now you might wonder, what is the exact benefit of a stronger collaboration? What's the point? And so in our paper, we argue and present several options and possibilities, and I'm going to focus on four of those today in my remarks to give you some of an idea and a flavor of the possibilities for enhanced collaboration and enhanced effectiveness of their efforts. So on the one hand, we have more effective and targeted norm development. On the other hand, we have faster implementation procedures on the regional and national level. We also believe that it could lead to more coherent inter-regional collaboration and to more effective capacity building and awareness building. So what does this mean in concrete terms? For example, collaboration between the UN and regional organizations could lead to a development of a clear framework for enhancing the positive, mutually reinforcing impact of global and regional efforts. And such a work plan or roadmap could easily be harmonized and brought together. So for example, when the GGE limiting norm that states that states should not knowingly allow their territory to be used for internationally wrongful acts using ICTs, when you look at that language, it has clear connections to both national capacities to address malicious or criminal use of ICT infrastructure, but there's also, this area is also covered by, for example, ASEAN, who's been very active in the past years in this particular field. And the OEC is addressing this issue via a workshop series as well. Another example would be the norm on that states should not conduct or knowingly support ICT activity that intentionally damages critical infrastructure. This neatly aligns with multiple critical infrastructure protection efforts, such as the CBM 15 of the OEC or the Organization of American States capacity building workshops on this particular matter. Another potential benefit of increased regional and global cooperation lies in the effective follow-up work on the regional level. If a certain initiative is included in the GGE process without including regional organizations' considerations, it might prove difficult for regional organizations to follow up if their mandates do not overlap with the initiative at hand. So having regional organizations be part of the framing procedure could prove quite helpful in preparing a regional follow-up projects. When looking at the coherence between GGE reports and regional organizations' activities, there's significant potential in lining them up, for example, through a joint work plan or regional roadmaps, which could be annexed to the new working group reports. These roadmaps may include guidance and recommendations on regional implementation that is tailored to the respective components and considerations for within these regions themselves. And so having regional organizations in the GGE jointly develop these documents could significantly improve the implementation process and also the overall impact of the new reports. Regional organizations, especially those with national offices and national capacity building efforts, have extensive insight into both national concerns but also regional trends, similarities, differences, and possibilities for collaboration. So they can therefore clarify how the newly proposed UN priorities line up best with both national priorities and regional trends. So having conducted capacity building and norm and CBM implementation for many years, this is an area where the UN can profit significantly from regional expertise. Similarly, regional organizations have developed their own innovative concepts in the past years that might be applicable to the global level as well. For example, the OEC has something called the Adapt a CBM initiative. Yes, we're no longer adapting children, we're now adapting confidence building measures, which means that states who feel particularly committed and strong about a certain CBM can then push for further implementation, usage, and connect that to practical ideas and visions how they believe the respective confidence building measure could best be used, applied, or further enhanced. And this concept could easily be applied also to norms. So there could be a targeted norm campaign driven by volunteer states that now might provide new room for suggestions on how norms can be best applied and implemented. And implementation is something where regional organizations can make use of their extensive national and sub-regional network, as I just mentioned. So having these organizations here, all of them have great logos, by the way, so I couldn't resist but put them up. This is something where it's really worth looking into what these organizations have done and critically reflect how we can make use of these existing experiences and expertise. Now, when it comes to the second question on inter-regional collaboration, we, in our research, noticed that there's a lot of potential for inter-regional collaboration amongst these regional organizations. So these and many other organizations worldwide are keen on contributing to the enhancement of international cyber diplomacy efforts, either through their CBM efforts, their capacity building initiatives, their dialogues that they're fostering. There's a wide array of possibilities that they have designed for their own interests and purposes. at the OEC, we tried to engage in this conversation through an interregional conference 2 years ago with our partners in Korea, in Seoul. And this was actually quite an interesting exercise to meet up in Seoul and see what the similarities and differences are between the Asian region and the OEC region, see how we can sort of support each other and figure out how sort of the contributions from a regional perspective toward international cyber stability efforts can be enhanced, how we can learn from each other. We conducted the same sort of exercise this year again, just a few weeks ago in Korea, and yet again, it really goes to show that it's quite interesting to bring experts from these different regions together, not just to share the different perception, but to really figure out, okay, how can we sort of take advantage of the unique characteristics of regional organizations and regional efforts that are taking place. However, in order to understand the similarities and differences, and make room for potential collaboration amongst regional organizations working on cybersecurity issues, the right platform and format needs to be identified. And so maybe instead of leaving it to regional organizations themselves, a third-party platform like a UN agency might be one to bring actors together on a regular basis and to facilitate such an exchange on a more structural, long-term plan. So once established, an interregional collaboration would facilitate gaining specific insight on related cybersecurity initiatives by other international organizations. So additionally, there's a potential to really maximize the impact of overlapping activities. We always speak about avoiding duplication of efforts, but I mean, they do exist, especially across the regions. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, seeing how similar initiatives or workshops are conducted across the regions might prove to be quite helpful and interesting. And maybe there's even room for collaborating and planning joint workshops, trainings, or even conferences. And lastly, maybe the above-mentioned regional implementation roadmaps could be accompanied by a UN-led cyber capacity building initiative, specifically designed to diplomacy, norm, and CBM matters in cyberspace. This is not to completely scrap away the existing capacity building efforts, but to figure out how sort of the services that are provided across the regions by a variety of actors can sort of be lined up and potentially be sort of increase their own positive effects, seeing how things work out, which procedures are effective, what kind of training components work especially well when we look at norm implementation or going through scenarios to figure out how states can make best use of the existing international legal structures. So I hope this gives you some inspiration for the upcoming diplomacy negotiations. For those of you who will actually be involved in the DG negotiations, please consider our proposals. We're not territorial about the ideas, so please make use of them. We won't charge you a fee. There's not going to be a copyright infringement. We always appreciate a reference. But overall, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Nicholas and Anna-Maria, for your excellent paper and for the presentation. I think you really made a compelling case for the benefits of the collaboration of global norms platforms with regional organizations, and in particular, looking beyond the immediate outcome of a particular sort of a platform or of the UNGG or open-ended working group, and looking into the long-term, more systematic and perhaps more substantial norm adherence and implementation. So I know that I'm eating my own words. I forgot to give you a chance to ask questions of Heli. In order not to discriminate against any of the speakers, I hope you're okay if we leave the questions towards the end. And then, with that said, I'm happy to give the floor and turned on microphone over to Mr. Stefano Mele.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Mele.
Thank you.
Please.
Oh, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the center for inviting me. It's a great honor and privilege for me to stay here today and speak with you about the role of G7 states in promoting security and stability in cyberspace. First of all, despite it's now broadly accepted that international law applies to cyberspace and that this absolutely relevant objective was the product of the hard work made inside of some international organization, like for example the United Nations, it seems to me that the majority of states still prefer a bilateral and direct approach to diplomatic relations instead of multilateral agreements, especially when we talk about cybersecurity. This is the main reason for it is because bilateral relations offers a more advantages if compared to multilateral approaches, also and especially when a topic affects jurisdiction and culture very different from each other, as is the case with cybersecurity. By way of example, a bilateral agreement allows a state to choose the other state to enter into a diplomatic relation with, instead of being forced to negotiate with a vast number of states. This is a very relevant, in my point of view, advantage, as it enables states to gauge the duties they're willing to abide by, based on the specific historical moment and the counterparty's feature. And this never happened in multilateral relations, since all the actors must take on mutual responsibility toward a vast number of states. Furthermore, bilateral agreements are usually much easier to be negotiated and can also be kept more easily, can also be kept secret more easily than multilateral one. This represents a greatly appealing feature, in my point of view, notably when the subjects deal with are particularly sensible, for example, such as military and intelligence topics. In addition, bilateral agreements can also be much more detailed than multilateral ones, particularly regarding the rights and duties a state commits to take on the diplomatic and political level. On the contrary, multilateral agreements, due to their own nature, cannot be focused on gaining broad consensus on principles often considered too high and general. Lastly, bilateral agreements can be easily changed according to the future needs and the rapid evolution, technological evolution of the scenario, for example. So, unfortunately, currently all states seem to prefer bilateral agreements and direct state-state dialogues instead of multilateral approaches within international organizations, also when the topic is cybersecurity. And this is a problem. Because, in my point of view, it is very relevant to underline the importance of the initiatives driven by state, regional, and international organizations and the private sector to promote non-binding international norms on responsible conduct for the security and stability in cyberspace. This is because, for example, building a real and effective deterrence cyber strategy is also based on the possibility to publicly condemning at international level the conduct of a state and subsequently to sanctioning those cyber activities that violate European and international law principles, especially if the state responsible for the attack adhered to these principles through commitments made in European forum, for example, and within international organizations. This is the case, for example, of last week's decision of the European Union Council, the number is 796 of 2019, concerning restrictive measures against cyber attacks threatening the European Union or its member states, by which European Union can now decide to frozen all funds and economic resources belonging to, owned, held, or controlled by any natural or legal person, entity, or body that made or attempted to make a cyber attack with significant effects against the European Union or its member state. So, from this point of view, in addition to what has already been analyzed by the distinguished speaker before, we cannot omit, in my point of view, the role played in the last year by the G7 states. That is the informal forum for international cooperation between the most industrialized countries in the world, that are Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, United Kingdom, and the United States, that, for instance, in 2016, through a document completely dedicated to the topic of cybersecurity, named G7 Principle and Action on Cyber, has underlined the paramount importance that cyberspace must increasingly have in the political agenda of each government and each state. Furthermore, among the various commitments undertaken in this document by the G7 states, in addition to an always desirable reaffirmation of the principle aimed at safeguarding, for example, data protection, privacy, and also the human rights, as well as the cooperation and information sharing for the fight against terrorism and cybercrime by states, what is, in my point of view, certainly striking is the explicit recognition of the possibility that in certain cases, cyber attacks may be qualified as a use of force or as an armed attack, and that from this descend the right of states to self-defense, both individually and collectively, provided for in Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations. This recognition, in my point of view, shows how much the strategic approach of the main powers is changing over the time from a mere cyber defense posture to a real development of offensive capabilities in and through cyberspace. All this, however, without clear strategy on this issue having been consolidated within international bodies, and above all, without an international framework of globally shared and accepted standards for the use of offensive cyberspace operation, at least at the moment. Moreover, in my point of view, it is precisely the issues of standard and the essential legitimacy of the conduct of states in and through cyberspace that are at the heart of the subsequent document of 2017 and 2019, naming respectively G7 Declaration of Responsible State Behavior in Cyberspace and Dinard Declaration on the Cyber Norm Initiative. Both these declarations, in fact, firmly highlight the applicability of international law, and in particular of the United Nations Charter, also to the cyberspace domain, in order to maintain peace, stability, and above all, to promote an open, safe, secure, stable, accessible, and peaceful cyberspace. In particular, the recent Dinard Declaration of the Cyber Norm Initiatives commits all the G7 states to encourage better and increased voluntary exchange of information among G7 states and with others on the steps taken to understand and effectively implement the voluntary non-binding norm and recommendation of responsible state behavior in cyberspace, but also to share the best practices and lessons learned that will be identified as a result of this process with a wide range of states and other stakeholders. Also to engage with other states to include them in a peer learning, cooperative, transparency, and confidence building efforts. And the last one is to cooperate to help build partners' capability to implement the above-mentioned voluntary non-binding norms and recommendations. In my view, it's also interesting to note that G7 leaders have long clearly indicated that the conclusion of the reports of 2010, 2013, and 2015 of the UNGG should always serve as a guide for each state stressing the need to increasingly enhance international cooperation and facilitate the implementation of confidence-building measures aimed at reducing the risk of conflict arising from the use of information and communication technology. Furthermore, at least at the present time, I see that France seems to be the most active European country with regards to the development of diplomatic dialogue about cybersecurity. As you know, in mid-November of the last year, in fact, following the outcomes of the Internet Governance Forum in Paris, French diplomacy took the lead, proposing the Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, that is an initiative aimed at creating a common consensus at international level on certain rules of conduct of states with regard to cybersecurity and internet, from protecting citizen, critical infrastructure, the supply chain, and the voting system also, from cyber attack designed to cause significant damages, to the promotion and implementation of confidence-building measures for cyberspace between states, and very, very relevant, the prevention of forms of hacking back by non-state actors and private companies. And it is clear for me that the document presented by President Macron is a commendable attempt to keep political and public attention on this issue. And the French Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace has been welcomed more than positively by states and by some of the major multinational companies. In fact, to date are 66 the states that have joined this initiative, 139 the international and civil society organization, and 347 entities of the private sector, both from the world of technology and security and from the world of the provision of essential services. However, in my view, within this long list of membership, more than the attendances, what I see is the absences that make noise. The United States, Russia, and China, for example, are missing from the subscriber. The reasons that could have pushed the three main powers in the field of cybersecurity to this choice, in my view, are easily identifiable. First of all, for example, the United States, in my view, have no interest in weakening its leadership role in the development of sector policies, accepting also to recognize French as a privileged interlocutor. At the same time, Russia and China could not have accepted to sign part of the measures indicated in the French document, since some of these measures seem to have been written precisely to limit those actions in cyberspace for which the West is accusing them for. What I see, what is evident in my point of view, is the emergence of proposition for concrete commitments at the moment. We need to find ways to be more practical and more concrete on this topic, especially because I see a very interesting increase in multi-stakeholder bottom-up activities in proposing international norms. And so we have to find ways to involve also the private sector. And one of the elements that is, in my humble point of view, very, very interesting of the Paris call is that they involve the private sector inside of these norms, of these principles. Sorry. In conclusion, I think that we must wonder whether the flourishing of multilateral discussion in several contexts, often very distant from each other, could not lead already in the short term to a dispersion of the efforts of the main players on international scene, thus leaving room to immobility and strategic detachment. My personal view is that we must continue to push and push again on some of the most relevant initiatives at the interregional level, such as OSCE, G20, G7, ASEAN, and so on, because they can create, and they are creating the floor for the consensus on norms and recommendations that can be used at international level. So, for example, at the UN level. Simultaneously, I think that we must be prepared to control the flourishing of single or small initiatives to avoid what I say, the immobility and the strategic detachment of the main national actors in the field of cybersecurity. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Stefano. I poke with a question here. Estonia's former president, Toomas Hendrik Ilves, a few years ago on the CyCon stage proposed the creation of a cyber NATO, so a coalition of like-minded countries. And the CCDCOE itself, the organizing organization here itself, has actually grown beyond the range of the usual suspects of NATO allies and EU member states. So how successful do you think such sort of coalitions of the like-minded, not formal international organizations, but more like MOU setups could be to achieving state commitment to norms of responsible behavior?
I think that is fundamental. It's a fundamental element to create the environment to push on these norms. So we must continue to creating common consensus on this norm, on these principles, on this recommendation to help at international level to create the binding norms in the future.
So you think the boiling over of those norms initiatives beyond the established international formats is not only inevitable but also necessary and helpful?
Yeah, I agree.
Thanks. Well, thank you for the presenters, and I'm happy to give you all a chance to pick on their brains and their insights. So we have a microphone, or at least one, yes, up here. So we already have a question up front, so if you could...
Thank you.
Also, please introduce yourself so the audience knows.
I don't think it's on. Is it on?
It works.
Okay. Thank you. Tina Park from the NATO Defense College in Rome. Thank you for such interesting presentations. I have different questions for each speaker, if I may. So for Ambassador Termaklan, I wonder if you could comment on the issue of attribution and imposing consequences. So often when we look at some of the major non-state terror groups or countries like North Korea, attribution is an issue with their cyber crimes. So we understand generally that it's important to impose consequences, but in the absence of clear attribution, how do we go about it? And for Mr. Ott, you mentioned some of the joint exercises and training with the South Korean government. I wonder if you are able to share some of the logistical aspects and major actors involved, because from the South Korean perspective, there is clearly a threat coming from North Korean hackers, especially on critical infrastructure, as well as just prevalence of North Koreans in different aspects of South Korean bureaucracy and a general banking industry. So if you could comment to the extent that you're able, what had happened, and if there are prospects for further collaborations, that would be great. And to Dr. Mele, I have some questions about the last part of your presentation, and mainly the absence of agreements and participation from actors like Russia and China. So again, knowing that countries like Russia and China are very important, as well as the United States, in enforcing these new norms, in their absence, how do we then go about enforcing these issues? Because my involvement with G8 and G20 countries in the past has made me realize compliance is really the issue. You know, they will come up with great ideas, and yes, we could pass another communique, but if they don't follow up with concrete actions, then there's absolutely no use in passing another declaration. So based on your experience, could you perhaps elaborate on how do we move forward with the issue of enforcement? Thank you.
So quite a bit of ground to cover. Heli, would you like to start?
Attribution is possible. First. Secondly, attribution is possible. And third, attribution is possible. So otherwise we wouldn't be able to investigate cybercrime if we would say that attribution is not possible. It takes time, maybe. Yes, it's complex. Also, when we talk about the attribution, then it consists of the technical bit, but also the political and legal assessment, and then eventually it's a political decision. So therefore every attribution is political. So I think many countries have started to look at their internal procedures, how to attribute. Estonia has put together the attribution guidelines internally, which we also have shared with our EU and NATO partners. And we see that not many EU and NATO countries have the clear division of labor internally, how they do attribution, yes. But the number is growing of those countries who are already more experienced and mature in this field. So therefore, I think it's a bit of a question of maturity level here in understanding cyber threats, and also it depends on the technical skills and technical capabilities and forensics capabilities, but not only. So I think it's a kind of a complex issue, and each country has to find its own approach how they attribute. But if we look at the conventional fields of attribution, I'm quite sure that in the beginning of the CBRN, you know what is CBRN? It wasn't so clear either how to attribute exactly. But since this field has been around for such a long time now, nobody is questioning this. In cyber, we are not there yet, so we just have to grow in maturity, and also the understanding of different countries has to become a bit uniform, how exactly attribution happens. So, and I think this is a process. But we have attributed WannaCry. The group of like-minded countries has made a collective attribution statement attributing WannaCry to North Korea. So it was a state actor behind. We do not think it was a crime group only. It was supported by the state. So, yeah. It's an old news for me, at least. Yeah. So, yeah.
Nicholas.
Thank you for your question. On sort of OEC-Korea collaboration, it's worth noting that the OEC has a network of partners for cooperation that stems beyond sort of the OEC region, and Korea is one of them. So within that framework, Korea engages with the OEC quite extensively, and in this particular matter also not just within Vienna and our sessions and the diplomatic meetings, but also in a concrete event and activity. And since Korea, as you probably know, is a fairly developed and advanced country, and like IT is floating all around them, this is obviously a topic that they're very much interested in. And so together with the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who was in the lead in sort of setting this conference up, the OEC Secretariat was very happy to have this interregional engagement, first and foremost to really see what the similarities and differences are, because of course, as you just mentioned, North Korea is considered quite an issue for the Koreans, but then at the same time there's other things that both regions have in common, be it sort of the struggles with how to implement certain technological challenges, or when we look at the international negotiations, we look at the capacity building. And so since the ASEAN Regional Forum was also very much involved in the conference setup, this helped us to also look at sort of the two regional organizations' efforts in this field, in particular when it comes to the norms implementation and the CBMs. We brought along Thailand as the current chair. Singapore was very much involved. So it's a great opportunity to bring sort of the regional stakeholders into one place and really see how their work lines up. Yeah, hope that helped answer your question.
Thanks. Stefano.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the question. It's not quite simple to answer to your question, how to moving forward after what happened in 2017 at UNGG. Probably what I see from my point of view, I think that Russia, China, and Cuba in particular opposed in 2017 from the report for a precise political approach that is not guided by the cyberspace but other political reasons. So I think that regional approaches should be the right place to create the consensus or the floor to start again at international level inside the UN to create a common consensus or a recommendation and norms. But actually, I seem very difficult that it will be realized, yeah, in the short term at least. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, more questions from the floor? Oh, certainly. You were first. The lady in the black in the back.
Thank you, Dominic Luzansky, consultant in London. I really thank you for your presentations. All of you are saying similar things about regional and like-minded organizations. Completely agree with the regional and like-minded organizations. Have been advocating that for a while. I just want to talk about a little bit, and I just tweeted at Nicholas briefly about using the UN as a way to convene or to sort of coordinate. One of the tendencies is the UN is political in terms of different agencies, and I wanted your opinion on the fact that when it comes to cybersecurity and cyberspace, there's more of a tendency to potentially, especially with Russia and China, to want to veer it towards the International Telecommunications Union. And that's something that I know our allies would definitely not want to do. So I just think I wanted to hear a little bit more about maybe thinking about alternatives or what you think about the politics inside the UN and also taking into account the high-level panel going on. Thanks.
Thanks for the question. And Nicholas, it was directed to you, but if the other ones or other speakers want to add something, you're welcome.
So a few months ago, we had the chance to have such a sort of an international, interregional coordination workshop in that sense within UNIDIR, and that was something that was actually quite interesting because they, together with CSIS, set up this meeting in Geneva to figure out what the similarities and differences are across regions, across institutions, and they were fairly inclusive in their approach. So it wasn't just sort of the flags and banners that you saw, but the Forum of Incident Responders was there, and many other organizations like the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. So really the organizations that are very much engaged in sort of transnational, international activities, whether or not UNIDIR feels willing, capable, and ready to sort of convene this on a more substantial basis. That's obviously up to UNIDIR. Of course, depending on which forum you choose, there's different implications within their mandate, within what they can do. So if you place it within UNODA, of course, there's a tendency for first dimension perspective. So yes, there's a drawback and there's a challenge to really figure out which forum you use. Some people might even argue that sort of the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise might be a chance to have more of an interregional information exchange. So I don't have sort of the key for which forum should be the right one. I think in the end that's also a decision to be made by these actors to really figure out how this best serves sort of the actual goal that is then agreed upon on this interregional collaboration and information exchange.
Haley would like to add something.
Yes, you are absolutely correct in your judgment that the like-minded countries usually try to avoid take up the cyber issues in the UN context. It has the history in internet governance. So there is an old row between the free and open internet community and UN, certain UN nations' desire to put internet under the multilateral structure of ITU or some other UN system. Agency. And because of this philosophical difference between the democratic countries who would like to maintain the free and open internet, and we are happy to have the multi-stakeholder governance model, and we don't mind that ICANN is governed by the law of California, whereas we know that there are a number of countries that would like to have the DNS system and all the internet infrastructure somewhere on their territory. And I think this is the reason why still we, the cyber diplomats, also avoid as much as possible all these discussions in the UN framework. However, it doesn't mean that the UN discussions are totally unnecessary, but we have to make sure that if we have a discussion at the UN under a certain committee, then it stays there and it's concentrated on certain issues. Of course, now we have very exotic situation where all the cyber issues will be discussed under the first committee, which is a disarmament committee. So, and I don't know how it goes, honestly speaking. If we start discussing all sorts of simple cybersecurity, more economic side of cyber issues under the disarmament context, it certainly does not add anything useful to this debate. The question, of course, is where in the UN to take up these questions. And possibly the high-level panel, which you alluded to, should result in some sort of more clear coordination structure between all these different parts, moving parts of the UN, however. So therefore, I think the approach that the high-level panel has is not on cyber, as you know, it's on digital. So there is possibly some set of recommendations that they set forward, how the UN can turn its attention to the digital issues. And majority of those questions are still dealing with the digital divide in the UN context. So all these cyber issues we discuss here at CyCon have not reached majority of the countries in the world, so as you know. So therefore, we like to keep it that way. So thanks.
Thank you, Heli. Thank you. Thanks to the both of you. I think we had a question. Lisi, you had a question, and then we had someone in the on the other side of the hall.
Hi, Lisi Adamson, the Hague program from Cybernorms, and I have kind of 1.5 questions to the ambassador. The first being, Anthea Roberts has written excellently on the issue, and she has asked very correctly, is international law international? And she has answered, no, it's not international. So we have fundamental differences in states pertaining to what is the role of international law for them, how do we understand international law. So in the context of the UNGG, are there any possibilities, or if there are, how can we minimize this divergence in these different fundamental views of the role of international law in general? And that leads to my second question, because you outlined very neatly what are the kind of the contestation points when it pertains to international law in that framework. And you also said that you're kind of a glass half full person. So my question pertains to what are the some of the aspects of international law where you can see that we can make real progress so that it won't become this tug war between those contestation points. So where can we realistically make progress? Thank you.
First, what's the role of international law in the GG context? Well, you possibly know very well that the US resolution has eliminated this difficult issue. So the international law will not be discussed at the GG at all. This is now the verdict, because this was the reason why the last GG fell apart. However, instead, countries are invited to add their views on how international law applies to the final GG report. And this is because, as you know, the Western countries and China and Russia are not agreeing, Russia less, but it's mostly China, which are not agreeing that international law, current one, applies at all in cyberspace, at least in its entirety. So it's like, in order not to stuck again in this question, the question is off the table. This is happening normally in any negotiations. Therefore, I don't think that we will get stuck in international law issues at the GG process. So we will rather possibly look at the implementation of the current norms. which of course also entails a lot of international law discussion indirectly, but in diplomacy it doesn't quite often matter what you exactly say, but how you say it and what kind of terminology you use. So it's a bit of this kind of compromise game there. And your second question, can you remind how exactly did you frame it? So what are the areas of international law where it is? The contestation areas. Possibly we will not even have a very clear understanding amongst the like-minded right now, how the certain issues apply. And the more you dwell, and the more you find the new questions. So the contestations point sovereignty, certainly, is something where we are still, everybody is struggling, but what is exactly sovereignty in times of digital technology and in times of packets moving throughout 77 territories in 2 seconds. Well, this is out there. We have to discuss it. I think none of the like-minded is saying very clearly here what exactly it means. And I don't think we have to get stuck there, actually. If you don't know the answer, we just pass and then we go on. The easier call would be to concentrate on obligations, so that you have to keep an order on your territory, and it also is in 2013 report that you are responsible for your proxies, and you are responsible for activities on your territory. If you are not able to provide enough capabilities in order to stop the malicious activities on your territory, at least then you should cooperate, and the others can help to mitigate the situation. These kind of notions are already in the 2013 and 2015 reports. So therefore, I think trying to find the common areas of concentrations, I think, should be the way forward, and not get stuck in these legal discussions with 5 lawyers in the room and 5 different opinions. I think none of the policymakers actually wants that. So we are very pragmatic. We want to go ahead. And if there is a too difficult discussion, we just push them aside and go ahead with other things. So this is what happens in real life.
The problem is also
Nicholas,
the lawyers.
Stefano, I think I saw you both.
We don't need you so much. You should know it.
I think I saw you both nodding intently. Is there anything you would like to add to this?
I largely agree with what you just outlined, Haley. I think the real emphasis now is placed to implementing the agreed upon languages. There's a lot of work to be done. There's key components that really need to put into practice, and there's an extensive network of institutions and agencies who can help contribute with that. So I can see a lot of potential in also using the GGE format to be more precise in how to operationalize the agreed upon language, so that we're not just moving forward in terms of width, but also in depth in the context that we already created.
Thanks.
I agree. This is the right approach. Yeah, we need to create the consensus, the same definition of the topics. So it's the only way is what the ambassador said.
Thanks. So more questions. Whoever was sitting over there, yes. Thank you. I think we have 2 of you, so you can pass on the mic afterwards. No. Go ahead with the question.
I go on. Hello, I'm Samuel de Thomas. I'm at the CCDCOE here in Tallinn. So basically, thank you for your speeches. And one thing that I notice is that I don't certainly see immobility in cyber. So basically, you did a good job to show us how many different working groups, regional organizations are working sometimes at the same goals and objectives. Here I'm referring a little bit to the different approaches that the UN is taking for cyber norms, for example, the UN GGE, the UN Open-Ended Working Group, for example, that probably are discussing there will be probably some overlapping issues or overlapping problems to be discussed at the UN level. So my point is a little bit thought-provoking, otherwise there's no fun. Do you think that this emerging, this extreme proliferation of different organizations, regional, international, you name it, also the Paris Call, so national, are kind of countering the emerging creation of cyber norms. I'm not talking about international level, just like cyber norms, just a political level.
It's exactly what I would like to say during my speech. We have to push on the right places, but we have to control the flourishing of initiatives, especially when there are small initiatives, single-state initiatives. Even if I see that Paris Call is a very interesting initiative, especially because it involved the private sector for the first time. So I absolutely agree. It's fundamental to create at regional level a common consensus, but we have to control the flourishing of these initiatives. My view.
Or we have to increase personnel significantly in cyber.
Oh, yeah.
To cover all sorts of initiatives.
So we can cover it.
Yeah, so there should be a special cyber budget, 2%. So, yeah, it was a joke. So.
Nico, would you like to add something, or shall we ask Samuele to pass the microphone over your shoulder?
Yeah.
I mean, states decided to pass on these two resolutions, and so now there was a majority, and apparently a large quantity of states sees merit in having those two UN working groups, and the other existing four also have sort of their purposes, and it remains to be seen how they will be used. It's obviously up to the states, but that's kind of everyone's guessing at this point how they will move forward.
So yes, please.
Cadet Brian Kenrick, West Point. There was a lot of talk about operating at the norms in cyberspace, but it seems that different countermeasures and repercussions, so to speak, aren't necessarily stopping cyber attacks from happening. Do you think countries operating the norms at some point will have to break away from that in order to implement harsher countermeasures to actually stop these cyber attacks?
I can take it. Well, certainly there should be some consequences at some point, yes, because otherwise it's not so obvious that there is incentives, there are enough incentives for the countries to stop the activities. And I think some analysis should be also done, what kind of response would work on different countries. Maybe for some the public attribution is already working, but for the others the public attribution or sanctions are not working, and you have to go a bit further. So I think this kind of assessment is currently taking place amongst the like-minded, how to tailor the response so that it would be efficient.
Consequences are fundamental. Looking at, for example, the European Union Council decision of 10 days ago to create a norm to frozen all the economics of the states, entities, bodies that have created a cyber attack that with a high level of damage. So absolutely, normally if you don't have consequences, you don't, why have to stop to make crimes, to make espionage, terrorism attack, and so on. So it's fundamental.
So thank you for the answers. I think our time is running out, but I don't want to let you off the stage before I tease you with a bit of future gazing. So considering where we have come from the first ever nation-scale cyber attacks in 2007 and compared to where we are now, if you look down the road about 10 years, where will you expect that we will be in terms of peace and security and stability in cyberspace? So will states learn to restrain themselves, or are we looming towards a chaos?
Well, I think we have not seen a armed attack type of cyber attack, not really. So therefore, possibly the state actors are exercising restraint. So what might be the issue for the future is the very fast proliferation of capabilities. And the cyber black market is a very lucrative business, as I understand, and many countries, many governments, and also many non-state organizations might just acquire the capabilities and unleash them without understanding the effects. And this might, yes, be the next event, which will be the paradigm-shifting event, another one. So
much like happened with WannaCry and NotPetya, in a sense.
Yeah, WannaCry and NotPetya were deliberately unleashed, but well,
yes,
WannaCry not so much.
The spillover was
but there was
probably
a spillover
that
was not possibly measurable, yes, beforehand. But I'm talking about very serious capabilities, which are not just the ransomware type of capabilities. So. And we hope that this will not materialize. But the proliferation of players in the field is a serious issue, and we have to start thinking how to make sure that we can somehow contain the proliferation of malicious tools.
Thank you. Nico?
Well, if I knew where we are in 10 years' time, I think that would
make
me... or just a very helpful person that can figure out how to prevent potential negative impacts. I don't know. I think the one component that I'm passionate about is I see a lot of potential for enhanced awareness and capacity building across the regions. I think including the Global South, making sure that there's an inclusive discussion, helping policymakers to figure out how to properly address this, in understanding sort of the potential technical implications of policy work. These are considerations that I think receive more and more attention within the respective fora that I used. I think it's great to have the Global Forum of Cyber Expertise that's trying to pull together different expertise and is mapping all these activities. I see a lot of potential in expanding that, improving that, and making use of so that we can actually take advantage of the frameworks, the decisions and agreements that have been agreed so far, and I think that's enough work to do for the next 10 years.
Thanks for that. And Stefano.
Thank you. From state-state relationship, I'm quite positive in the next year. We are resolving the problem of attribution very, very fast. We need to create a common consensus, as we already said all during this meeting. The problem will be with non-state actors, in my point of view. Proxies is a very relevant actor, and will be in the next year the most relevant actors also in a state-state relationship. So I'm Italian, I'm a lawyer, and we very love to quote ancient Roman words. And my preferred is si vis pacem para bellum. If you want peace, prepare yourself for the war. So probably, yes, we have to prepare for the war to reach peace.
And the clapping or the applause in the other room reminds me that they are discussing AI. So we will have interesting times ahead, that's for sure. Thank you very much to the panelists for your engaging remarks and the discussion. Thanks, you've been a great audience. Thanks for your active questions. And I think I can release you to the coffee break now, whatever's left of it.
Thank you.
Thanks.